Hi there. Hopefully you've skipped past pages 4 and 5 because we're not doing anything on chromosomal abnormalities in 2020. And we're now on page 6 of your Unit 4 Area Study 1.1 notes. And this is a little chat about selection pressures. So having a look at this gigantic dot point again, the bit that this video is going to cover is just this tiny little bit about what are selection pressures, and then the next video is going to go into natural selection and what these selection pressures have to do with that. So to begin with, I want you to think about this situation. So some people in the world are born with a variation, so that's a difference. They're born with gills due to a genetic mutation. So there's some mutation, some change in their DNA, and it means that their phenotype shows up that they have gills. Now, today with our world, do you think this is going to be an advantage? Is it going to be a disadvantage? Would it help someone survive if they had gills? So you can have a pause, you can have a think if you want. No right or wrong necessarily, but you might have come back and gone, okay, it's not that valuable to have gills. Yeah, gills are only helpful if you're underwater. What about if you're in this scenario? What if our sea levels rose? What if the world flooded? Would having those gills be an advantage or a disadvantage? And now you might go, oh yeah, maybe having gills, if we flooded, then we could be able to occupy a larger area, so therefore it'd be a good thing. So it's the conditions in our surrounding environment that determine whether or not a new variation is a good thing or a bad thing. And these environmental conditions, so the environment surrounding us when these mutations happen or these variations occur that puts pressure on them, that's called a selection pressure. So selection pressures or selecting agents are normally environmental factors, and they act on your phenotype. So they act on the way that that characteristic appears. They don't directly act on your genes. The selection pressures or the agents will determine whether or not a phenotype is better adapted or an organism is better adapted due to their phenotype, and therefore whether or not they survive. The biggest thing about this is that the trait will be passed on to their offspring. And then you'll see this giant yellow box. Now, this giant yellow box is the what not to do. Never, ever, I don't want to hear you ever say that the organism adapts to the environment. Yeah, cut it out from your vocabulary. No, we're not saying adapt to the environment. Yeah, it doesn't work that way. We don't adapt to the environment. The variation must already exist. Yes, so the variation must already be there, and then a selection pressure will act upon one of those variations. You can't just change the way you are because the world floods. Yeah, there had to already be someone that had gills. So if the environmental selection pressures change, then the alleles, so now we're going back to the genes, now the ones that are the most advantageous, so the ones that say code for the gills in the water scenario, will allow that survival to increase. And so over time, over many generations, because that's what this whole unit is about over time, change over time. Over time, those genetic changes will happen. The allele frequencies will change. And it's this whole theory about these shifting allele frequencies that is the basis of evolution, and therefore this theory of natural selection. So natural selection is nature selecting the best suited individual. So thinking about this, what kind of selection pressures do you think might be really important when driving evolution, that change over time? So pause, have a think, see what you can scribble down, and then come back. All right, massive one. We talked about it with our gills scenario, climate change. Now, any kind of climatic changes will cause massive selection pressures. Natural disasters can cause a massive selection pressure on an environment. Also predation, maybe there's a new predator that's come into the area. That's going to definitely drive change. Disease is most certainly going to be driving evolution. So new diseases that come out can change the allele frequencies. So all of these are examples of selection pressures. So the selection pressure, the most important thing to understand with my selection pressures is that all of these things, and competition, all of these things are environmental factors. Okay, they're things that are occurring outside of the individual that are having an influence upon the traits that you might see, or the traits that are advantageous. So have a look at an example. We'll have a look at the Bengal tiger. Hello, Bengal tiger. The Bengal tiger lives in regions that become extremely cold. Yeah, so we don't often think about tigers living in cold environments, but these Bengal tigers have to be able to deal with this extreme cold. So this extreme cold, that there is my selection pressure, because it's something in the environment that is going to drive the change. As a result, the organisms that have thick layers of fur are the ones that are genetically fit, or the ones that are selected for. And this is what we'll come back to in our next video. So we're down the bottom of page 6. And so what it says is, it says that tigers with the allele for the thick fur can be considered what we call genetically fit. Yes, so the ones that have the allele for that fur are genetically fit. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that the trait is dominant. It just happens to be, in this case, that it is dominant. So this is not necessarily linked anything to do with whether or not something's recessive or dominant, but it's just going to help us with this next scenario. So if a tiger being conceived accidentally gets 2 copies of the recessive alleles, then their phenotype is that they have no fur at all. Okay, so their genes mean that their phenotype is no fur at all. As a result, that trait is lethal. The moment that winter sets in, that poor tiger isn't going to be able to survive, and so it dies. So the selection pressure in this scenario was the temperature. Yes, so remember, the selection pressure is something in the environment. Okay, and it selects those with fur. So this is the advantageous trait, is to have fur, and therefore it selects that dominant allele. So over time, what do you expect to happen to the frequency of that dominant allele? Yeah, so you would suggest that over time, the frequency of the dominant allele will increase. Okay, that would be a reasonable suggestion. And so that's kind of it on selection pressures. I just want to take you back to here just to finish us off. So remember, these are something in the environment that puts a pressure on a population and might help us select for a particular type of individual.